So tonight we have with us a personal friend of mine, Gary George. He and I don't know if y'all know that I worked with hospice for 11 years, not at his hospice, which is the big mistake that we all have out there. Is you work for hospice, so do you know so-and-so? It's like, oh, I don't know how many hospice workers there are across the state of Nebraska. There are several hospices in Omaha. But Gary is the executive director for Josie Harper Hospice House, and he and I work together on end-of-life coalition work for 6 years probably, and I'm just a big fan. So I had to twist his arm to get him to come here tonight, and you'll all be wondering why at the end of this, because he said he's just got a lot to share personally and professionally with us. So I asked him, November is also Hospice Month, and so I had asked him to come and just share some of his...
That's not a good sign. Or maybe it is.
Maybe it is. Anyway, I don't need to be on the recording. So I asked him to share some of his stories from his experiences working with the dying, both through Hospice House, but before that, Gary was also with the Nebraska AIDS Project and probably walked with a few dying people on that journey as well. So without further ado, please welcome Gary George.
I will speak loudly until they get a microphone back here, but it really is a pleasure to be with you tonight. It's an honor to be asked. I appreciate that. And what I'm talking about tonight is really near and dear to my heart, that's for sure. But it's not the usual presentation that I give. So I'm happy to take questions later in the evening and talk more specifically about hospice itself. But I'm going to talk a bit about some stories about what we do in hospice, what happens at end of life, and with a bit of attention to the what's in it for me stuff. Now, before I start, I want to tell you that I am clergy by background, and so every now and then I get to do supply preaching in churches. And a few weeks ago, I got to preach over at First Christian Church. People say the most interesting things when they're going out of church to the clergy person, and they're intensely nice if you're a guest there. They say nice things no matter what. They're not possibly going to be mean. But I had the most interesting comment from a woman who came out after church, and she was carrying this clearly a very, very tiny baby. I said, oh my gosh, that's such a tiny baby. She said, yeah, she's just 11 days old. And she said, you know, she made 2 dirty diapers during your sermon. So I start with that as either fair warning, although this isn't a sermon, just to let you know. Sometimes people have reactions, and she did. So I'm just delighted to be with you here tonight, and start out with that question of what do we all have in common. We always talk about that to say yes, death and taxes. Frankly, it really is just death. 100% of us are going to die. We don't necessarily like to talk about that, but it is a one-for-one thing. It isn't optional. We ignore it, we avoid it as much as possible, but it is always a one-to-one thing. We're all going to die. In hospice, we believe that it matters how we die. I can tell you in 18 years at Hospice House, people put an intense amount of interest and meaning into what they think is going to be that last moment of life. It's not unusual for people who have family members at Hospice House who are getting some signs that their loved ones are actively dying to be gathered at the bedside, wanting to be there at that moment, making sure that somebody is there. If there's a group of them, they might even have people assigned with different duties, watching people breathe. So one person might be assigned to watch the rise and fall of the chest, and that gets a little bit more difficult as time goes on. Somebody else might be assigned to be hanging on to someone's wrist and counting the pulse in the wrist. It also gets thready and weak and quite irregular and difficult to gauge. And somebody else is assigned to be the timekeeper to watch exactly what time that moment is. And people are watching this, breathing in, breathing out, not breathing in again, and wanting to be at that moment. So We put a lot of emphasis in that. People remember those moments. And sometimes people are really disappointed if they miss that moment. And sometimes that moment is really difficult to identify because it really isn't like on TV where you're talking and breathing and telling lots of great things to those people gathered around you and then you just drop over dead. It doesn't typically happen that way. So death is really a journey. We put a lot of emphasis in that moment, and it does matter how we die. We want it to be peaceful, we want it to be well managed, and we do want there to be good memories associated with that, and everybody does it differently. But it's not like it used to be. Well before my time, death used to take place at home. People cared for parents, people cared for grandparents in their own home, people died at home, and even before the funeral industry, people then were taken care of at home after the time of death. Bodies bathed, bodies left in the home setting for families to come and visit. It used to be very much a part of life. People died young. We've gotten rid of lots of childhood diseases, so we don't see death around us as much as we used to. But people died frequently. When we were in France a few years ago, I remember hearing a story from our tour guide talking about folks in France sometimes buying an animal, a pet, when they had a child, kind of at the same time. And part of that was their intent to say this child is going to grow up knowing how to nurture this loving pet and care for it, but also expecting that this pet is going to die sometime during this child's lifespan, and they will have an experience that will be important to them. So they wanted to focus on that, but it's not like that anymore. We've come to a point where death is highly medicalized. We created intensive care units, and so people can be treated and put on life support. People go in and out of hospitals for diagnostics. People rarely die at home anymore, although that's where most of us say that we want to die. It doesn't happen that way so often. So we've really changed the way we do death in a big way, and we've removed it from ourselves. We want to control it. Even though it's a one-to-one thing, we're born, each of us, we're going to die, each of us. We want to control it. I don't know how many of you used to read Funky Winkerbean. Anybody remember Funky Winkerbean cartoon strips? Anybody remember Lisa in Funky Winkerbean? Lisa was a woman who was loved. I didn't read the comic strip, but she got cancer, and she went through treatment, and her cancer went into remission. And then later on, I don't know if it was a few years later, but sometime later, her cancer came back, and ended up that she went on to hospice. It ended up that she died. And it's interesting to see the reactions that people have to that cartoonist, how negative, how angry sometimes people were that he was invading their comic strip world with something so unpalatable as death. And how could he do that? It's amazing. Meerkat Manor. Anybody used to watch Meerkat Manor? There was apparently, I didn't, but apparently one of the best loved grand dames, I don't know what you call the head meerkat woman in a meerkat show, but anyway, there was some battle, and this well-loved meerkat died in this battle, and people again were up in arms because if there were cameras there, if there were crews of people, they could have intervened and they could have kept this well-loved animal from being in this fight, in this battle, could have protected her. So we really just keep pushing this away. I worked with a wise guy many years ago, back at Nebraska AIDS Project actually, and he used to say that his sense was that the invention of the stethoscope back in 1816, which was a wood cylinder, that 18 to 16 inch piece of wood cylinder that allowed a physician to listen well to a heart. The first time physicians could actually listen to what was going on inside of somebody without actually cutting them open, which often had really bad consequences. But that was, this wise coworker of mine said, was that first introduction to distance between us and our healthcare workers. Prior to that wood cylinder stethoscope, physicians had to lay ears on chests and ears on stomachs to listen to bowel sounds and feel for temperatures and take pulses and actually touch people. but that stethoscope introduced that distance that has now become just exponential. People monitoring our own heart rhythms while they're sitting at computer banks in other states, on other continents even. It's amazing what's happened. We've pushed away lots of what used to be very high touch things that took place in medicine and made it very technical and far out of reach for us. I just want to say a couple of things about hospice itself to give some grounding, and then we'll move right on from that, because I don't want this all to be about hospice. But just to be sure, hospice, where I work and where Kelly used to work, hospice itself is a philosophy of care that provides for people who have been diagnosed with a terminal illness, folks who physicians have said that they have 6 months life expectancy probably, people who have chosen not to do curative treatments for their diseases, or maybe they've sought all of those and they've not been useful for them. And the philosophy of care is built on foundation of conceptualized by Cicely Saunders from England back in the 60s, where hospice teams are caring for the physical symptoms, the psychosocial and spiritual needs of people in that situation. So that's what we do in hospice. The idea being maybe that we're becoming more high touch, as hospice folks will say, and less high tech, letting loose of some of those things that have put distance between us and our practitioners, those electronics, the monitors, and all those testing and kinds of things that we use. And hospice allows us to get back to high touch and connecting with people, just person to person, caregiver to caregiver. What that means, we hope, in hospice is that some of our folks are going to be able to accomplish some things that might be considered on their bucket list at this point. And these things up on the screen are all things that have happened to folks at Hospice House through the years, with the exception of travel to Paris. That one didn't happen. It almost happened, but it didn't happen. But the rest of these things all did. And largely because of what hospice is able to do when they can come in and support family caregivers and take away some of the 24-hour burden of the caregiving, allow families to realize, oh, here's something that my father really wanted. He really wanted to be a citizen of the United States, and hospice made that happen. We had a young woman at Hospice House many, many years ago who was blind, and one of her lifelong wishes was to get to meet Stevie Wonder. And the hospice team didn't get her to meet Stevie Wonder, but she got to talk to him on the phone, which was just dreamy for her. It was amazing. The only negative of that was that Stevie Wonder didn't get briefed well enough on what was going on with her. So when she was saying, well, I'm in a hospice and I'm dying, and he was trying to talk her out of that. Oh, don't talk that way. No, you need to go back. So she was so thrilled to get to talk to Stevie Wonder, but then turned into this angst about, does my doctor really know what he's talking about? Because Stevie Wonder said that I ought to be doing this. Wow, amazing. But so we should have done a little better briefing of Stevie Wonder and that. But she was so thrilled to get to do that, talk to him on the phone from her Hospice House bed. We had a younger father at Hospice House a few years ago who had a young son, kind of early teenager, maybe 13, 14-year-old. And one of the things that father wanted to do and did do was to create a plaster cast of his fist. We often do some hand cast, hand moldings of things. He wanted to do a molding of his fist. And he wanted that to be presented to his son at the time of his death, along with a letter that explained to his son that for the rest of his life, if he ever needed to have the strength of his father, if he never ever needed to know the presence of his dad, that he would be able to go and fist bump with his pop. And it was an amazing thing to that kid. I thought it was quite a gift, quite a visionary thing for that father to do. It was really amazing to me when I went to the funeral and that 13, 14-year-old son got up at the funeral home and carried the fist up there, the plaster cast, and set it there on the stand and told stories of his father and fist bumped with his dad in front of the group. It was just amazing. Those kinds of things and so many more can happen as people are on hospice care, and somewhat letting loose of some of those attempts at cures and treatments along the way that are elusive and maybe even impossible for them. So it brings it to a what's in it for me, because this is pretty important, I think. One of the things working in hospice for us is that we get to watch, we get the gift of watching every day how people themselves make a choice to die. And we all get to do it our own way. We all get to die. We get to do it our own way. And so we get the advantage of watching that and deciding what's going to be right for us when the time comes to be ours. Maybe it allows us to become more comfortable with our own death. I don't know. I think that's true. I hope so. But I'm not the guy laying in the hospital bed right now either, so I don't know what that'll be when I get there. I do know that it can facilitate open discussion. If you are a hospice volunteer, if you are a hospice worker, if you've had somebody on hospice and you talk about that with others, you might get the reaction of people go flying the other direction because they don't want to be confronted with that. Other people might really gravitate to you and say, oh, I want to tell you a story, or I want to ask you a question. So it really does facilitate open discussion and almost even demand some open discussion among families. It gives you the opportunity to create those legacies, some things that you want to have live on after you, and the awareness that you are going to die, that I'm going to die, and having that awareness before getting a diagnosis really does allow us to make some planning for those kinds of things. Discussing advanced directives is a very important thing. I think it's a huge gift of working in hospice because we get the advantage of watching what happens when people haven't done that and some of the difficult stories and family situations that we navigate because people didn't make their wishes known or clearly enough that it makes discord in families. Just this morning I was having a group of chaplain students at Hospice House, and one of them showed up a bit early, and she was kind of blown away by our facility. It is a really nice place, I like it, but she was really having a reaction, wow, this is just beautiful. This is really amazing. And she said that a few times, and then she said, but I'll never be living here. And, well, that's an interesting thing to say. Why not? And she said, oh, we've made it very clear to our children. I don't know if she said she had 6 or 8 or 10. She had some large number of children. We've made it very clear to our children, and we modeled for them that we cared for our parents at home until they died, and our children will do the same. I said, well, that is a really good goal. It's really good that you modeled that. But I said, let me tell you something. You might want to think about that, because I've sat around the table too many times with families who had made those promises to their parents, to their partners, their spouses, but it just couldn't happen because no one knows what life is going to bring to us down the road. So I said, you might just want to say to them, if this can happen, we would like to be cared for at home, but give them the gift of saying, if it can't, it will be okay, and we'll understand there's a good reason for that. So that's one of those things that can happen. And she said, oh, we'll do that. We talk about this every year. We will do that. We'll bring that up. I think they're the ones that do it at Thanksgiving. The day after Thanksgiving is a big day to talk about end-of-life stuff. So I think they might do that. The opportunity to unpack unnecessary baggage and pack the right thing. Again, that comes from negative experiences more often than not of watching people who have burned bridges, people who have fractures in their families and with their loved ones and have not found the opportunity or taken the opportunity to say I'm sorry or to try to make amends. And that can make very difficult end-of-life situations for them when those kinds of things are looming in their mind while they're busy trying to die. So it really does allow us working in hospice to be able to maybe let loose of some of that and get the right things on board with us. These are just great questions, I think, to ask periodically at any time. What was my purpose in life? I think it's useful maybe even to ask every year, what was my purpose? What have I been doing? what have I done this year? Who are my teachers? Who did I help the most? It just allows us to begin to think about what is my impact here? And to ask people in hospice these questions, get amazing kinds of stories from them. And just start really broad and beautiful conversations that they like to share. So it's useful to ask others, but it's really useful also to ask personally of ourselves. The main thing here is that, what's in it for me? And it is that I might live life differently if I catch myself in time by learning from those people that we've cared for, had the honor of caring for at the end of life. And always a recognition that it's a work in progress. I like this photograph from Cathedral of Notre Dame in Rouen that is started being built. The cathedral started to be built in 1220 and was said to be finished in 1880, I think it was. And yet you still see, I love this, you still see some windows that are not stained glass windows that you might expect. It is still in progress. We have an opportunity always to recognize that we too are in progress and we can be growing and continuing and changing all the time. As I come to a close here, one of the things that has been weighing on my mind, and I suspect your mind and all of our hearts, is just what's been going on in Paris in the last several days. And I think that we hear those things with heavy hearts, we hear the stories, and we hear it not only with heavy hearts, but maybe a tiny bit of understanding, given what all of us have lived through here in the United States back years ago. As I listened to one of the reports on NPR the other day, I heard a man from Paris talk about what he planned to do, and it took me back to September 11th, 2001 at Hospice House. It was a day, and even as I bring up that day, you all have memories of that day yourselves, on what you were doing, what you did. At Hospice House, that happened to be a day when our air conditioning was broken. And so it was also a very pleasant day in September here in Nebraska. So it was really a beautiful day, and we weren't that harmed by not having air conditioning. And I got got notified that one of our residents, I'll call her Jenny, in room 11, wanted to talk to me. She had lived with us for quite a long time, and she could be nice, but she could also be pretty darn prickly, and she had some high expectations. So it wasn't the first time I'd gone to talk to Jenny, but I knew that when I went down the hall to talk to Jenny, I was going to get reminded that we didn't have air conditioning while I was going on. So I kind of dreaded it on this particular day. I did make my way down to Jenny's room, and of course she had her TV on, and what was going on the TV was just the constant visuals of the Twin Towers falling. And so I was sitting talking to her in her chair. The TV was there. I could see the TV out of the corner of my eye. I was making efforts to be engaged with her, at least I thought I was, and trying to listen and be a little sympathetic. And she was doing exactly what I thought she would do. When is the air conditioning fixed? What's wrong? You know, are you going to spring for the cost of an overnight express delivery of this part that you need? And and finally, although I did think I was being engaged with her, she took me by the hand and she said, "Gary, I've lived for 90 years. I've lived for 90 years. And this may well be the worst day that I have ever lived through. But I've lived for 90 years, and tomorrow's going to be another day. And we're going to need air conditioning." And it was a wonderful gift to me. It's one of the things that I remember most vividly from that day, because it was the one voice of hope that just came shining through everything else. Tomorrow's going to be another day. It was a fabulous gift from dear Ginny in room 11, and I won't ever forget it. What reminded me of that the other day was just hearing a man being interviewed from Paris, and he happened to be a baker, and the interviewer on NPR said, "What are you going to do tomorrow?" And he said, "I'm going to bake bread. We eat bread. I'm going to bake bread." So with that, I say it is all about tomorrow. That's what we learn in hospice. Tomorrow might be our last day. We don't know that. Tomorrow might be my last day. I don't know that. But the hope is that we can live each day from the lessons that we learn from those around us at hospice. And so I will stop there and see what comments you have, what stories you have, what things to add to this night. Yes, please.
Do you find that in working with people that most patients are resolved and at some peace at the end?
Yeah, question is, are most people resolved and at some peace at the end? I think my experience is generally yes. Not 100% of the time. And there are lots of things that play into that. And it can be traumatic events in past life. It can be unresolved issues. It can be lots of things, questions about what comes next, some guilt things. But in general, we see people having resolved many of those things. And I do credit hospice with that in a big way, because I think that once people get onto hospice, I think they have some opportunity and some resources brought to them where they can actually resolve some of those things. You know, I know that we've had hospice chaplains who've heard confessions from people about things that they did in their past that they've never been able to tell anyone ever, and kind of allow them to unburden themselves. At the same time, we have people who don't have resolution very well, and that is troublesome, I have to say, to those of us who work in hospice. People can be very angry and resistant and rigid and push back all the time. It isn't common, but it happens, and it's those moments that we have to remind ourselves that it is not my death, it's theirs. We want to support someone as best we can. We don't want to shy away from them, but we can't demand that they die peacefully. They get to die the way that it's right for them. But most people, that's not true. They've got things resolved. Yeah.
Thank you.
You had a question?
My mom went through hospice in Colorado, and she stayed at my sister's house, who's a nurse. Does Nebraska have a program similar to that, where the state contributes so much money to that house to make that possible?
The question is about doing hospice in the home setting and some of the funding issues behind that. Hospice is a Medicare benefit, so it's a national thing, and the way hospice was set up in the United States back in between 1983-86 roughly, as a benefit of Medicare Part A, was to support the kind of care that your mother received in home. So that care is delivered by visiting hospice teams, professionals, nurses, social workers, bereavement counselors, chaplains, home health aides. They go in and out of somebody's home setting and assist the family, friend, faith community caregivers around that person at home, so that they can provide care for as long as they can, maybe all the way through to the end of life. Medicare will pay for that staff time of those visiting people intermittently. Medicare will pay for medications for comfort based on the disease going on, and Medicare will pay for equipment that might be needed to help keep somebody at home, generally hospital beds, wheelchairs, walkers. So that's the funding stream that would be there to assist. When we do surveys, which we do in Nebraska about every 3 years at the Nebraska Hospice Palliative Care Association, one of the questions asked is something along the lines of, if you had a terminal diagnosis, if you knew you needed hospice care, where would you want that care to take place? And oh my gosh, 98, 99%, 96% of people always say, at home with my family, friends around me. That's what we have always wanted in the United States, and that's why, one of the reasons why the benefit was set up that way here, to really help support that. So people who come to Hospice House are in the very, very smallest group. Most people get their hospice care at home and die very peacefully and very successfully with family members around them. Yes, please.
There's been a lot of publicity about the amount of money that's spent for medical care in the last week or two of life. Based on what you see, is there a change in that? Are more people opting to make other choices as opposed to having every possible resource poured at them? What's happening with that?
There's a lot of research that questions about the amount of money spent close to the end of life for someone, and if there's a change in that, seeming to be a different trend. There are different studies out there, so it depends on what you're reading, whether or not it's an enormous amount spent at end of life or not so much. What is true for hospice right now, and has been for a while, is that people are starting on to hospice later. You remember it said, people could be on for 6 months. We're seeing people starting on to hospice much later in their disease process, so maybe not getting on until a month or two away, sometimes a day or two, a week or two. So people are starting much later. That would suggest to me that no, we're not any different than we used to be. People are still doing lots of curative treatments and attempts all along the way. And that being said, there's lots of criticism from the hospice community about why is this happening? Why are people not starting on to hospice sooner? And sometimes we do that with a poke in the eye at the oncologists, that they're treating and treating and treating and stuff like that. Well, I'm not so sure that's always true. On the one hand, I think of my aunt who died of breast cancer many years ago, and even before hospice was around, that she went through some really, really grueling treatments for her to try to cure her breast cancer. It was largely unsuccessful all along. She never gave it up, but it was really impacted her life in what I thought was what I remember as a very negative way. Now I see people who are going through treatments where their quality of life isn't impacted all that much, maybe a little bit, but they're still doing well. So when you think of that, you think, well, if these are even have some remote possibility of treating, why wouldn't I continue? It's not impacting me so much. And at the same time, as I not so long ago sat with a group of oncologists talking through some of these things, what they said to me was, we tell people, we try to be as realistic as we can and give people the truth. And sometimes they say back to us when we're saying, no more treatments, and they say, oh, please, just one more, please. And so, they're kind of caught as well. So there's some of both of that there, I'm sure, of us not getting people onto hospice sooner. But I also think that there's a stronger reluctance now for us to talk about end of life, death, and the reality of that than there ever used to be in the medical system, frankly. I think that we've taken a big step back from being able to have frank and honest conversations. I think that's my own opinion again, is that's partly due to the insertion of hospitalists who don't have a long-standing relationship as your personal family physician. So you pop into the hospital and you get some bad news, and that hospitalist may not see it as his or her responsibility to share with you what you might want to do and being on hospice care, because that's somebody else's responsibility. The palliative team sees their role as different than that as well. So I think that we have a ways to go before convincing all of us that we can have these conversations. The other thing that I hear frequently from the medical community is that, in medical school I didn't get taught how to give bad news. When I was a social worker, we didn't talk about this. When I say, what? It's a one-to-one thing. We all get to die. We've been doing it since we were born. It doesn't really take an advanced degree. It doesn't really take a special seminar, a special certification to sit with somebody and say to them, I am so, so sorry. This is the picture that I see. And I'm sorry, here are the things that we can do. I don't think it takes much more than that, just that sense of being honest and real and human with each other. But I think that we in hospice have kind of built it up, that it's a big conversation that's hard to have, and you need to have some training, you need to do it right, and all this kind of stuff. I think you just need to be human and be able to say that. I'm way off on a tangent from what you asked a question about. I'm sorry about that, so I'll stop. But what other questions. Are there comments? Yes, please.
Well, this is kind of a comment. It's very interesting that you chose room 11 because just recently I'm a massage therapist and I worked on a client in room 11. And that's why I'm here tonight. It was difficult. She was someone I had not seen very often, and her end of life was very quick. 5 weeks from diagnosis to death, or something like very close to that. And my population of clients are aging. You know, they're in their 70s and so forth, and people are coming in with this anxiety about aging and dying because everybody knows they're going to die. It's there. So I end up listening a lot to people. And I don't even know where I'm exactly going with this. And just as an aside, I also worked for 12 years at Nebraska AIDS Project. So it's kind of, that was different because it was something that was more identifiable in a certain way. Even cancer is identifiable as well, you know, that people will die from. But one of the things I guess I'm kind of, one of my questions is how does hospice work with death with dignity? You know, like say for instance a person would choose, and I don't know if there's state laws or things like that where people can choose to have more morphine than maybe is recommended, or you know, how does that work in hospice? Because the client that I saw had lung cancer and it was really difficult. And so I was just kind of curious how that works.
Yeah. The death with dignity, there are certainly state laws that regulate everywhere what can be prescribed, how much can be prescribed, who can prescribe, and all of those kinds of things for all kinds of medications. And Nebraska is obviously not a state that has enacted legislation that says you can do physician-assisted suicide or medically managed suicide, as I prefer to call it. So we don't have that here. Our goals in hospice, though, very much are that people can die with dignity, that people can die with their symptoms well managed. And so we would be wanting to administer doses of symptom managing medication based on the symptom. So we would not shy away from, in hospice, giving a dose of morphine to somebody who was in pain and it was time for their med, they needed it, it was clear. We wouldn't step back from that and say, I can't give that to you because I'm afraid that's going to deplete your respirations and it's going to bring about death sooner. We would never do that in hospice. And the reality is that dose of morphine is very, very unlikely to hasten death ever. That's one of the things that the founder of hospice, Cicely Saunders in London, one of her primary ways of convincing people that hospice was a good thing was by showing that if you, and morphine was the drug of choice then, it still is a great drug for lots of reasons, if you incrementally increase the dose to match the symptom, you're not ever going to decrease somebody's respirations to the point where you cause death. If you go from here to here, oh sure, that's going to have an impact, but not when you're just going incrementally. And on top of that, Cicely Saunders convinced the world that there is no upward dosing of morphine. You can never reach a cap. So you can keep upwardly dosing as long as you need to, and you'll be okay. But our goal would always be to care for people and their symptoms and be doing that according to physician orders and under our own license that we can practice under. And never wanting to hasten death. That's not what we do in hospice. And at the same time, we don't ever want to delay death particularly. We want to be supporting people for as long as their systems will allow them to live.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Sure.
The matching symptoms.
What else? Yes, please.
I actually just wanted to say thank you for sharing your stories. I worked in hospice for about 3 years as a music therapist.
Oh, great.
And I found everything you said, I went, yeah, okay, yeah, I know. I mean, that, the thing that I loved about my time in hospice was that I had my first daughter right after I quit doing it. And we've always, talked to her about death as part of life and that kind of thing. And so when we recently experienced that in our family, she knew what it was. Now, granted, it didn't prepare her for everything that went along with it, but she knew what death was, and she knew the permanence of it, and I was so thankful for those 3 years that I had there that taught me how to do that and how to help her grieve better and all that kind of stuff. So,
Thank
so
you
yeah.
for that. Thanks for your work in hospice as a music therapist. That's a great thing. Music brings a lot of joy to people and elicits memories and amazing things. We have lots of musicians that come to Hospice House, and there was a woman and her granddaughter was with her, and we had a merrymaker. If you're familiar with merrymakers in town, one of the merrymakers was there, and professional musicians that go room to room sometimes, and he was singing a kind of a ballad of some sort, and our residents started to sing, and the granddaughter said she had never heard her grandmother sing ever in her whole life, and Grandma was singing there in the hospice bed. It's amazing what you all do. Thank you for that. The other thing that you bring to my mind is just the importance of having honest conversations with kids, and because kids will ask questions and they need direct answers. They don't need more than they need, but they also just need to be dealt with, be able to answer questions and be quite frank and with them, and kids can handle things better than we tend to give them credit for. So I appreciate what you've done in your family. Thank you for that. What else? Yes, please.
One of your slides had something about contrast with palliative care,
Yeah.
and I think of palliative as you're caring for someone, but not trying to cure what's going on. Where does that fit, and is there a contrast, or how does it fit in with hospice?
Yeah. And although you're not a plant in the audience, I did actually add a slide here because I thought that might come up, so just in case. Yes, the one simple way to say this, and then I'll expand on it a little bit, is to say that all hospice care is palliative, but not vice versa. Not all palliative care is hospice. And so the reason for that is that hospice requires the end-of-life diagnosis, the terminal diagnosis, the 6-month prognosis, all of that kind of stuff, and not seeking curative treatments. In the purest sense of palliative care is looking at symptom management overall with no conversation about diagnosis, life expectancy, any of that. So that's in its purest sense what palliative is. It is to cloak is what it means, in cloaking symptoms, taking care of symptoms. What palliative tends to be in practice is caring for people who likely have a life-threatening illness, an end-of-life diagnosis of some sort, and allowing a consulting palliative team to come in and be a consult in a hospital setting, find ways to help a person overcome their symptoms that they have. But there's no requirement at this point in palliative medicine to be doing anything about people stopping their curative treatments. So it is a little bit ahead of hospice in a way, but if there were palliative people in this room, they would be ready to grab my throat because they don't want to be seen as the springboard into hospice. That is not what they see their expertise. They see their expertise to be symptom management for people. So there is, I think, sort of a natural progression, but we're all kind of figuring out how we play well together here. But that's the main difference between these two is all of hospice wants to be palliative because all of hospice wants to be symptom management, pain control, all of that stuff. All of palliative does not have to be hospice because it doesn't have to include the terminal diagnosis for somebody. We will watch this emerge. There is no funding stream for palliative care at this time. There is a funding stream in Medicare for hospice. So the only way that palliative medicine gets practiced right now really is by consult in hospitals. It can be billed under Medicare Part B, I think it is. Outside of the hospital setting, there may be some community organizations that have generous donors who funded palliative programs in the community where people can work outside of the hospital and provide this kind of care. But we're still in a world of figuring out where we're going with this, and it remains to be seen. Now, at the same time, let me say one other thing. For the first time ever since hospice was instituted back in 1986, on January 1st, there will be a new funding mechanism for hospice. And for a lot of years, they've been talking about a U-shaped hospice payment. The way it works right now is that Medicare pays my hospice team, if I'm a Medicare person, my Medicare benefit pays my hospice team a per diem every day that I'm on that service. So I don't know what it is. We'll say it's $140. I don't know. It might be that. But every day of that care. What the new mechanism is going to be is that Medicare hospice is going to pay a higher per diem for the first 60 days that somebody is on hospice. And then that per diem is going to drop much lower for the next however many days, months that somebody is on a hospice plan of care. When someone dies, Medicare will do a look back to say in the last 7 days before death, was there a registered nurse, skilled nursing visit, and or social work visit, and if there was those kinds of visits made to that patient, then there will be a higher per diem paid for those last 7 days. So it has become sort of this U-shaped possibility. So we're changing the mechanism for funding right now, and at the same time, we're also doing some demonstration projects, only 9 of them in the United States, but demonstration projects which will allow these 9 hospices either to have all of their patients or at least some of their patients be doing what we're calling concurrent care, meaning that they can do hospice care and do curative care all simultaneously, concurrently. And the goal of this is to say, will this cause people to say, you know what, these treatments are not so effective? For me, it goes back to your previous question. Will it save some money? Will people decide, I love this hospice group, this isn't going anywhere good, I can let loose of these curative things and just be already engaged with this hospice team that I'm familiar with. So we're doing some changes in the hospice mechanism right now, and I think that all of that plays into palliative. My hope is that down the road, we'll sort of break out of the 6-month requirement for hospice. We'll maybe break out of that very rigid requirement to be dispensing with all curative kinds of things. Maybe that's the direction that we're going, I don't know, but it's something that we'll be living through in the next few years. Yes, yes, yes?
So when Ira Byock was here a year or so ago, did I misunderstand him saying that some of his research showed that when people, probably in oncology, but they stopped the high intervention and went to palliative care, all of a sudden their life expectancy, made them leave hospice. I think those were some of his vignettes, that they entered hospice thinking this was over, but all of a sudden when they weren't doing the chemo and were having good diets and, a nice everyday life, their life expectancy increased. I mean, it didn't cure them, but their rates were so much better than.
There are studies that show that exactly what you're saying, that people, and just even engaging with hospice sometimes, you can compare people that go on to hospice as opposed to those who don't go on to hospice, who continue curative things. And there is some evidence to say that the folks on hospice have longer life expectancies than those that didn't. So yeah, so there is some evidence of that out there.
My mother had hospice at home for about 3 weeks before she went to the hospice house this year. And now, was that covered under hospice care or palliative care? We were never charged anything for it.
Oops, our mistake. I'll go check on that
Not too late.
No, we paid your bill. But,
So hospice itself.
One of the VNA nurses said something about palliative care, so I'm confused. Did she receiving palliative or hospice?
Hospice.
Okay.
Hospice, yeah. And the mechanism for payment is that visiting team is paid for by, like I mentioned, the nurse, social worker. That's paid through Medicare. When somebody needs to go into a facility like ours, they would be charged the daily care charge. It's a little bit too detailed for right now, but there are brief moments when Medicare will pay for days of care in a place like hospice house. It may be that your mother was at that level of care and that Medicare did pay her bill there. I wouldn't know that, but typically it's the responsibility of a person to pay their daily care charge.
I think we paid
if they're, We won't do a research on that. It's okay. We trust you.
Thank you.
Did you have a comment?
I fit in that whole question of palliative and hospice. I had one of those odd conversations with an oncologist that said I'll be dead in 6 weeks. And that's a curious moment, you know. But in the hospital then, what happened is they seemed to bounce back and forth between curative and palliative. And the palliative seemed to come in the form of pain management, is the phrase they used. And it seemed like one ebbed and flowed, and the other one came in, and slowly the pain management one went away, and the other one began to pick up. But there is a point where I think they're not sure which one to do. Now, I do have a question, though. There are some curious transition moments about life and death in there for me. Have you ever seen anything in your work that has informed or shaped your spiritual life? I'm sure you have, but is there any idea you could share?
I should have a better answer to this after working at Hospice House for 18 years. I consider myself Christian, and so that is still the underpinnings for me, and so that works. I also have a deep respect for mindfulness and some of those meditative traditions. What I've really seen at Hospice House in my time there that instructs me is the sense of awareness that people nearing death have of other people, other world, other something, and it is very, very real. Some long time ago now, one of our residents called for her son to come up from Lincoln one day. She needed her son. She was going to die that night. It was really an odd thing because she was really quite well, actually, and up and around and things. So I went to talk to her and I said, you know, this is interesting. What's this about? And she said, you know, I woke up today and there were angels in all four corners of my room. And she said, I remember when I was a very little girl and my aunt was living with us. And the day that she died, she woke up and said to me, there are angels in all four corners of my room. And so she said, I think this is my night. And well, we talked through that a little bit more, and she decided, her aunt hadn't been eating, and her aunt had only been in bed prior to that, and her aunt was really pretty debilitated, and she realized, I'm not quite in that same spot. So she became very embarrassed that, now I've got my son coming up here from Lincoln, he thinks I'm gonna die tonight. I said, you know what, Alice, I think it's okay. Look what you remember from your aunt years ago and how calm that makes you at this moment when you see those angels in the room. You're gonna do the exact same thing for your son. You're gonna tell him this story, and someday when it's his turn and he wakes up and sees angels in the corners, it's gonna be wonderful for him. So it is okay. It'll be okay if you don't die tomorrow. He won't be angry with you. And she didn't. She did. She lived for a long time with us. But those kinds of things, seeing people, knowing that somebody else is in a room, and I don't always get to hear it secondhand. The night that I came into morning report and the night shift said, you know what, the woman at 17 is pretty irritated with us right now because she asked us to go get 3 cups of tea. And so they're like, well, what do we need 3 cups of tea? Well, I'm going to have a party and these 2 others want tea. And so they're like, okay. So they went and they actually did. I go, did you go get 3 cups of tea? Oh yeah, we did. But it took them a little bit to get it. They got it back there and she was really irritated because the other 2 had left. But it was very real to her. And so we don't discount those things. We just listen to what are they saying to you? What is this about? And just honor that moment with them. We don't try to disregard it. So my sense of that is really some strong sense that we're more connected with what comes next somehow than we really know. And that's comforting to me. I appreciate that. So that's my best response. It's too long, but it's the best one.
Thank you.
That reminds me of once a nurse told me, if they tell you they're dying,
They probably are.
Yeah, absolutely, I will tell one more story. I don't know how much time. Maybe we're going too long. Okay.
Yeah.
There was oh my goodness, I have a few that I'm thinking of. Well, the one that came to mind first. One of our guys asked to be woke up early one morning, and he wanted to see the sunrise. He lived in room number 9, and he wanted to see the sunrise. That was important to him. And he had his wife come because he wanted to see the sunrise with her. And so we got him up. There was a sunrise. It was wonderful. And then he said, I'm going to die today. And he did. And there was no reason for it. It was just he wanted to see that last sunrise. He wanted to see it with his wife. He did that. She didn't even believe him. But that's what he said was going to happen. And indeed it did. It's amazing that can happen for people. So we honor those things, and when people are telling us that, we listen to them. We don't discount those kinds of things. And if it comes true, that's great, and if it doesn't, we don't reprimand them. It's okay. So that's all. Well, you guys have been wonderful. I am so grateful for the invitation. Thank you.